Todd Mitchell had always dreamed of owning his own home. After years of scraping by in cramped apartments, saving every penny from his office job, and watching others settle into their perfect lives, he finally managed to purchase a modest single-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. For Todd, the house was more than just a place to live. It was his first real symbol of success. A front yard with freshly laid sod, a porch he could decorate for the holidays, and a roof over his head that belonged to him alone. It was everything he had worked for. He wasn't the kind of man who needed much. Quiet nights, an occasional beer while watching football, and the sound of his sprinklers humming away at dusk were more than enough to make him happy. That peace was shattered one early morning. It started as a low rumble, the kind of sound you don't immediately pay attention to. Half awake, Todd turned in his bed, convincing himself it was just the garbage truck coming a little earlier than usual. But then the beeping started, the unmistakable, high-pitched beep of construction vehicles reversing. He shot up in bed, disoriented. Through his window, Todd could see something strange, the tops of hard hats bobbing up and down. He rubbed his eyes, hoping it was some kind of dream, but the sound only grew louder. Throwing on jeans and a t-shirt, Todd stormed outside, squinting in the bright morning sun. What he saw made him freeze mid-step. A team of workers, trucks parked haphazardly across his driveway, had already torn up a large section of his front yard. Shiny steel poles lay on the ground alongside massive rolls of black asphalt-like material, and a cement mixer growled as it churned nearby. A basketball hoop stood partially assembled, looming like a bizarre monument to chaos. One of the workers glanced up, barely acknowledging Todd, before continuing to hammer a support beam into place. Todd's voice finally caught up with him. "What the hell is going on here?" A stocky man in a neon vest turned, wiping his forehead with a gloved hand. He gave Todd a once-over, as if annoyed by the interruption. "Morning. We're setting up the new community basketball court. HOA's orders." Todd blinked, feeling like the ground had been pulled out from under him. "A basketball court? On my lawn? Are you kidding me?" The man shrugged, clearly not interested in a debate. "I just do what I'm told. You'll have to take it up with the HOA. All the permits are in order." "Permits?" Todd was nearly sputtering now, his anger rising like bile in his throat. "Who gave you permission to tear up my property?" The worker didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to his crew and barked an order. Todd stood there for a long moment, his fists clenched at his sides, his heart pounding in disbelief. He didn't even know where to start. HOA? Permits? He'd lived here for just over a year, and until now, his only interaction with the homeowners association had been a packet of bylaws and a welcome letter shoved in his mailbox. Nothing about a basketball court, nothing about his yard. Snapping out of his daze, Todd rushed back inside, grabbing his phone off the kitchen counter and frantically searching for the HOA contact information. He found the number and dialed, pacing the room as the phone rang. After what felt like an eternity, a cheerful voice answered. "Greenbrier Homeowners Association, this is Deber speaking. How can I help you today?" Todd didn't bother with pleasantries. "This is Todd Mitchell. I live at 1460 Oakwood Drive, and there are construction crews ripping up my front yard. Apparently you're putting in a basketball court. What the hell is going on?" There was a pause just a beat too long before Deborah's voice returned, noticeably cooler. "Mr. Mitchell, the basketball court installation is part of the Greenbrier Community Improvement Initiative. All homeowners were notified of the project via our monthly newsletter." Todd pinched the bridge of his nose. "I never saw any newsletter. And even if I had, you can't just take my yard. That's private property." "I'm sorry you feel that way," Mr. Mitchell, Deber replied, her tone robotic now. "But according to our most recent lot assessments, that section of your front yard is designated as common use space. Everything is perfectly legal. I suggest you come to our next HOA meeting if you have concerns." Todd's head spun. Common use space. What the hell does that even mean? "Have a great day, Mr. Mitchell." The line went dead. Todd stared at his phone in disbelief. Outside, the sounds of construction had only grown louder. He looked out the window to see workers unrolling blacktop across his once green lawn. A sharp pang hit his chest, the kind you feel when something important is taken from you, and you're powerless to stop it. By noon, the frame of the court was already in place. A few neighbors wandered by, pausing to look at the work in progress. Todd noticed them whispering to each other and casting curious glances toward his house. It was as if the construction had turned him into a spectacle, an unwilling participant in some bizarre HOA circus. When Todd tried to approach one of the workers again, he was met with nothing but shrugs and a curt, "We're on a schedule, buddy." Later that day, as Todd sat on his porch with his head in his hands, a group of kids from the neighborhood arrived. They ran around the unfinished court, shouting and laughing, already excited about the prospect of a new place to play. For a moment, Todd just watched them. He wasn't a monster. He didn't hate kids or the idea of a basketball court. But this wasn't about kids. This was about his home, his space being taken without his consent, and no one seeming to care. Then, as if to twist the knife, he noticed a white envelope sticking out of his mailbox. Todd pulled it out, ripping it open as he walked back to his porch. It was a fine from the HOA, notice of violation, excessive noise disturbance. Fee, $150. Todd laughed bitterly, the kind of laugh that sounds more like a growl. His neighbors might not see it yet, but this wasn't a community improvement. This was a land grab, pure and simple. And if the HOA thought he was just going to roll over, they were about to find out how wrong they were. Todd spent the rest of that day in a haze of disbelief and anger. Every glance outside the window sent another jolt of frustration through him. Where once there had been a neatly trimmed lawn, there was now chaos, workers yelling over the roar of machinery, piles of tools scattered across the dirt, and the cement mixer grinding endlessly like some mechanical beast. It wasn't just the noise or the intrusion, it was the utter disregard. No one had asked him, no one had warned him, and now it felt like his property was no longer his at all. That evening, Todd sat at his kitchen table surrounded by crumpled papers and HOA newsletters he had dug out of his junk drawer. He read them cover to cover, each word dripping with HOA jargon about community unity, enhanced shared spaces, and long-term improvement plans. Nowhere did it explicitly mention his address, let alone his yard, being selected for a basketball court. And yet, there it was, outside his window, like a slap in the face. He couldn't take it anymore. Pulling on his jacket, Todd stormed outside and crossed the street toward his neighbor, an older man named Carl who'd lived in Greenbrier for years. Carl was out on his porch, calmly reading the paper, as if the deafening construction was a mild inconvenience. "Carl," Todd called, trying to temper the edge in his voice. Carl looked up, adjusting his glasses. "Evening, Todd. Something wrong?" Todd stopped at the edge of Carl's walkway, gesturing angrily at the mess in his yard. "Something wrong? Are you serious? You don't think this is a problem?" Carl peered over his newspaper and squinted toward the basketball court. "Oh, that. Yeah, HOA's been talking about it for a while now. Some sort of initiative for the kids, you know. Good for community morale," they said. Todd felt his frustration bubble to the surface. "But it's on my yard, Carl. My property. How is that okay?" Carl shrugged, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "Well, I guess it's common use space now. They did a vote or something." "You weren't at the meeting." Todd nearly laughed in disbelief. "No, Carl. I wasn't at the meeting because I didn't know there was a meeting. Don't you think they should have told me? It's my lawn." Carl sighed and folded up his newspaper neatly, as though Todd's indignation was an inconvenience. "Listen, Todd, HOA runs things around here. That's just how it works. I don't like it either, but it's not worth kicking up a fuss. Trust me." "What does that mean?" Todd demanded, his tone sharpening. Carl's gaze shifted away for a moment, as if reconsidering whether to say more. Finally, he looked Todd in the eye and spoke quietly. "You don't mess with the HOA, kid. They've got ways of making life miserable for people who push back. Trust me, I've seen it happen." Todd stared at him, the words settling uneasily in his gut. Ways of making life miserable. What the hell did that mean? Carl didn't wait for more questions. He unfolded his newspaper, signaling the conversation was over. Todd turned back toward his house, his thoughts racing. HOA wasn't just overstepping, they were bullying him into silence. By the following morning, the basketball hoop was up, and the blacktop had been laid across what used to be Todd's perfect lawn. The court, though unfinished, already felt permanent, a towering monument to his helplessness. Todd sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching as the first kids arrived. They bounced a basketball back and forth, the sound echoing through the neighborhood like a taunt. Each bounce grated on his nerves. Thump, thump, thump. He gritted his teeth and tried to ignore it. Then came the laughter. Kids shouting across the court. A teenager turning up music on a speaker loud enough to rattle Todd's windows. He stood up, setting his coffee down with too much force. Enough was enough. Todd walked across the yard toward the court, his jaw clenched. "Hey," he shouted, trying to be heard over the noise. The kids paused, looking at him like he was some sort of alien life form. "Turn it down. Some of us live here, you know." One of the older teens snickered, spinning the basketball in his hands. "Relax, dude. It's a public court. We're allowed to be here." Todd's hands curled into fists at his sides. "This isn't public. This is my yard. I didn't agree to this." Another kid laughed. "Talk to the HOA man. They put it here." Todd wanted to argue, to scream that it wasn't their place to talk back to him, that this was his property. But what would that accomplish? They were just kids. This wasn't their fault. Defeated, he turned back toward his house, but not before one of the boys muttered just loud enough for him to hear, "What a psycho." The words stung, far more than Todd wanted to admit. He shut himself inside his house and slammed the door, the echo of bouncing basketballs following him. He sat at his kitchen table, head in his hands. How had it come to this? Later that day, just as Todd thought things couldn't get worse, he opened his mailbox to find another HOA envelope. His stomach dropped as he ripped it open. Inside was a notice of violation, noise complaint, excessive disturbance caused by property owner. Fine $150. Todd stared at the paper, his hands trembling. A fine? They were fining him? For their court? For their noise? It was absurd. It was insulting. He crumpled the letter in his fist and let out a bitter laugh, the kind that comes when you're on the edge of losing it. The days that followed were a blur of frustration and anger. The basketball court became a magnet for the neighborhood kids, and their noise was constant morning, noon, and well into the night. Todd called the HOA repeatedly, demanding an explanation, demanding they fix it, but every time he was met with the same condescending tone from Deber or some other representative. "I'm sorry you're upset, Mr. Mitchell, but everything is perfectly legal. If you're experiencing noise issues, you can file a formal complaint." File a complaint? Against whom? Himself? It was all a joke, a rigged game he couldn't win. One evening, as Todd sat in the darkened living room, staring blankly at the ceiling, he heard something shatter outside. The unmistakable sound of breaking glass sent him bolting to the front door. He swung it open and stopped short. His porch light illuminated the scene, shards of his porch lantern scattered across the ground, a basketball rolling lazily across his driveway. The kids were already gone, their silhouettes disappearing into the dark. Todd's chest heaved with anger, his hands shaking. He picked up the basketball and stared at it, his thoughts racing. He couldn't live like this. He wouldn't. Something had to change. The next morning, Todd took a walk around the neighborhood. He needed answers, and he needed them now. If Carl was right, if the HOA really had ways of making life miserable for people who didn't fall in line, then Todd needed to know just how far they were willing to go. He knocked on a few doors, hoping to find someone who would listen, but his neighbors greeted him with polite smiles and vague answers. "Oh, the basketball court? It's great for the kids, isn't it? What a lovely addition." Lovely addition. Todd's blood boiled. No one cared, or worse, no one dared to care. By the time he returned home, Todd knew one thing for certain: he was on his own. Todd's quiet mornings were now a thing of the past. The thump of basketballs on asphalt had become his personal soundtrack, an infuriating rhythm that accompanied every waking hour. By now, the court was fully operational, complete with painted lines and a shiny backboard that seemed to gleam mockingly under the sunlight. Every time he looked at it, Todd felt like his own home had turned on him, as if the place that was supposed to be his sanctuary had betrayed him. His phone calls to the HOA office had become a daily routine, though each one left him more enraged than the last. Debra's tone had transitioned from politely dismissive to outright condescending. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand this is frustrating for you, but the community voted, and the installation was approved. If you'd like to voice concerns, we encourage you to attend the next HOA meeting." Every time she suggested the meeting, Todd's knuckles whitened around the phone. "Voice concerns? What's the point if you've already made up your minds? I didn't vote for this." "I'm sorry you feel that way," Debra would say, her voice sugary sweet. "But everything was done in accordance with Greenbrier's bylaws. Have a great day." The calls always ended with Todd pacing his living room, furious and helpless, as if he were being deliberately gaslit by the very organization that was supposed to help him. The fines, however, kept coming. Another notice arrived in his mailbox that Friday, neatly printed on whole letterhead. "Excessive noise violation, $250. Todd nearly tore the paper in two. Noise violations. For a court I didn't ask for. For noise I didn't make. The absurdity of it all was enough to drive him to the edge. That evening, after another fruitless call to the HOA, Todd finally decided to attend one of their meetings. He'd avoided them in the past because he didn't care about landscaping guidelines or what color people painted their mailboxes. But now he had no choice. If no one else was going to fight back, he'd be the one to stand up and demand answers. The meeting was held in a small, fluorescent-lit community center a few blocks from Todd's house. As he walked inside, he was met with the hum of casual chatter from neighbors he recognized but had never spoken to. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and cleaning supplies. At the front sat the HOA board members, a panel of 5 people who looked more like corporate managers than concerned homeowners. At the center of the table, flanked by 2 other board members, was Sarah Hayward, the HOA president. Sarah was a woman in her mid-50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. She smiled as residents filed in, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Todd took a seat near the back, his arms crossed, listening as the meeting began with mundane topics, landscaping budgets, parking violations, and reminders about trash pickup schedules. Todd's leg bounced anxiously under the table, every minute feeling like an hour. Finally, Sarah opened the floor for community concerns. Todd shot to his feet before anyone else had a chance. "I have something to say." Sarah's smile didn't falter, though Todd noticed a flicker of recognition in her expression. "Mr. Mitchell, right? Please come forward." Todd walked to the front of the room, feeling every pair of eyes on him. Clearing his throat, he began. "I live at 1460 Oakwood Drive. About 2 weeks ago, without warning or permission, you installed a basketball court on my front lawn." Murmurs spread through the room, and Sarah held up a hand to quiet them. "Go on." Todd's voice sharpened. "I wasn't notified. I wasn't asked. And now I'm getting fined for noise violations from kids playing on that court. Noise that I didn't cause. How is that fair? How is any of this legal?" Sarah's smile turned tight, her tone practiced and measured. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Mitchell. However, the court installation was part of our community improvement initiative, which was approved in a vote during last month's HOA meeting." "I never got a notice about that meeting," Todd shot back. "It was announced in the monthly newsletter." "I didn't receive any newsletter." A few of the board members exchanged looks, but Sarah pressed on. "Our records show that all homeowners were notified, Mr. Mitchell. I'm sorry if there was a mix-up, but the decision was made democratically, and everything is perfectly within our legal rights under the Greenbrier bylaws." "Your rights?" Todd scoffed, anger boiling just under his skin. "What about mine? This is my property, my lawn. I didn't agree to this." Sarah's smile faltered ever so slightly. "Actually, Mr. Mitchell, that portion of your yard is designated as community space under an updated property easement from 2015. "What easement?" Todd demanded. "I never agreed to that." "You bought the property last year, correct?" "Yes, but..." "Then the easement would have been included in the sale documents. Perhaps you overlooked it. The room grew quiet as Todd felt the air leave his lungs. His mind raced. Sale documents. Easement. He hadn't seen anything about community space when he bought the house. Had he missed it? Was it buried in the mountain of paperwork his realtor had pushed in front of him at closing? Sarah continued, her tone turning colder. I suggest you review your documents carefully, Mr. Mitchell. If you have a complaint, you're welcome to file a formal dispute. Otherwise, this matter is closed. The murmurs started up again. Todd stood there, fists clenched, staring at Sarah. She looked back at him with a calm that bordered on smug. Finally, he turned and walked back to his seat, his heart pounding in his chest. The meeting continued, but Todd didn't hear a word of it. He sat in silence, staring at the floor, feeling a strange mix of humiliation and rage. When the meeting finally ended, neighbors brushed past him, offering small smiles or avoiding eye contact altogether. As Todd stepped outside, a voice called after him. Hey! He turned to see a man approaching middle-aged, with thinning hair and a tired expression. Name's Rick. I live 2 streets over. Todd shook his hand reluctantly. What can I do for you, Rick? Rick glanced around, lowering his voice. Sarah pulled the same thing on me 3 years ago. Different situation, but same tactics. I tried to fight it too, but you can't win against her. She's got the whole board in her pocket. And if you push too hard, they'll find ways to make your life hell. Todd frowned. What are you saying? I should just roll over. Rick shook his head. I'm saying you need to be careful. If they've got you in their sights, they won't stop until you break. With that, Rick walked off into the night, leaving Todd standing alone under the flickering streetlight. His yard wasn't his anymore. His neighbors wouldn't help him, and the HOA had made it clear they had the power here. As he walked back to his house, Todd realized one thing: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But if he was going to fight back, he'd have to be smart, and he'd have to be ready to lose everything. Todd spent the next several days obsessively poring over every document he had from the purchase of his house. The dining table became his war room, buried under stacks of paperwork, closing statements, inspection reports, mortgage agreements. He scoured every page for any mention of an easement, a shared-use designation, anything that might explain how the HOA could claim his front yard as community property. It became an all-consuming mission. He barely ate, barely slept. Whenever he stepped outside for air, the thump of basketballs greeted him, reverberating through his bones like a taunt he couldn't escape. It wasn't just the noise. Kids from all over the neighborhood were drawn to the new court like moths to a flame, trampling his remaining lawn, littering snack wrappers and soda cans everywhere. Some nights, Todd sat on his porch watching teenagers gather under the faint glow of the streetlight, yelling, cursing, blasting music through cheap Bluetooth speakers. He called the police once when the noise stretched past midnight, but they'd simply shrugged. It's a community court, the officer had said, like Todd was the unreasonable one. Nothing illegal about kids playing ball. The breaking point came that Friday evening. Todd had just collapsed onto his couch after another fruitless day, spent chasing down phone calls with the HOA. Every time he tried to speak to Sarah Hayward, he was met with stonewalling. Sarah's not available right now, but we'll pass along your concerns. They never did. Todd was no closer to understanding the truth about the easement than when he'd started. That night, the noise outside was louder than ever. Todd could hear shouting and laughter, sneakers squeaking across the blacktop, and the relentless thump-thump balls pounding the ground. At some point, a loud crack rang out, followed by roaring cheers. Todd bolted upright, his pulse spiking. He threw on his shoes and stormed outside, his porch lights snapping on to reveal the chaos. At least a dozen kids were on the court, along with a few older teens, some of whom he didn't recognize as neighborhood kids. Todd's eyes darted to his porch railing, where one of the decorative wood posts was snapped clean in half, hanging limply by a splintered edge. A basketball bounced lazily near his feet. Todd bellowed, his voice cutting through the din like a knife. The kids stopped mid-laugh, turning to look at him with varying degrees of indifference and annoyance. Which one of you did this? Todd pointed at the broken railing. A tall kid in a hoodie shrugged, spinning a basketball in his finger. It's just a post, man. Chill out. Just a post? Todd's voice trembled with rage. That's my house. My property. You're all trespassing. It's not your yard, dude, another kid muttered, crossing his arms. It's a public court. HOA said so. Todd's jaw clenched. He picked up the basketball at his feet and hurled it across the court with all his strength. It slammed against the backboard with a deafening bang, rattling the hoop. Get off my property. Now. There was a long, tense silence before the kids grabbed their things, muttering insults under their breath as they scattered into the night. One of them sneered at Todd as he passed. Crazy old man. Todd stood there, breathing hard, his fists clenched so tightly his nails bit into his palms. When the last kid was gone, he turned and stared at the broken railing, the fractured wood like an open wound on his house. His home had gone from a place of peace to a circus he couldn't control. And the HOA? They were winning. The next morning, Todd did something he should have done weeks ago. He called a lawyer. The attorney's office was downtown, a small but tidy space filled with shelves of law books and a faint smell of stale coffee. Todd met with Erin Chambers, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her early 40s. She listened intently as Todd laid out his story, occasionally jotting notes on a yellow legal pad. So, Erin said finally, leaning back in her chair, "You're saying the HOA installed a basketball court on your property without your permission, and now they're fining you for noise complaints caused by it." Todd nodded, his shoulders slumped. "It sounds insane when you say it out loud, but yes. And they're claiming there's some kind of easement, but I've been through every document I have. I can't find anything." Erin tapped her pen against the legal pad, her expression thoughtful. "It's unusual, but not unheard of. HOAs sometimes pull this kind of stunt, banking on homeowners not knowing their rights. Easements can be tricky, though. If there's even a hint of shared use designation in your property records, it gives them leverage. You're absolutely sure there's nothing in your paperwork?" "I've checked 100 times," Todd said. "But maybe I missed something." "All right. First, we'll get a full title search on your property. If there's no easement, the HOA doesn't have a legal leg to stand on. Second, I'll send a formal request to the HOA for all documents related to the court installation meeting minutes, votes, permits, everything. If they've been cutting corners, we'll find it." Todd let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope. "How long will that take?" "A few weeks, minimum," Erin admitted. "But it's a start." Weeks. The word landed in Todd's gut like a stone. He didn't know how much more of this he could take, but what choice did he have? 2 days later, the title search came back. Todd sat in Erin's office as she flipped through the report, her brow furrowing deeper with each page. Finally, she set it down and looked at Todd with something that almost resembled pity. "There's no easement," she said. Todd blinked, his heart leaping in his chest. "What? That's great, right? It means they're wrong." "It means they're lying," Erin corrected. "And now we have proof." Todd's relief was short-lived. That night, after returning home from Erin's office, he found a new envelope from the HOA taped to his front door. His stomach sank as he pulled it down and opened it. The notice of fine, property damage, violation of community standards, fee $500. The photo attached to the notice showed his broken railing, the same railing the kids had smashed the night before. The HOA wasn't just fining him for noise anymore. Now they were blaming him for the damage to his own house. Todd crumpled the paper in his hands, shaking with rage. It was a message. They knew he was fighting back, and this was their way of letting him know they weren't backing down. If Todd wanted a war, they were more than happy to give him one. He spent that night on his porch, staring at the basketball court under the dim glow of the streetlights. The blacktop looked slick and unnatural, like a scar that refused to heal. Todd knew he was running out of options. The HOA had too much power, and they were using it to bury him under fines and paperwork until he had no choice but to give up. But as he sat there, surrounded by the evidence of everything they had taken from him, Todd made a silent promise to himself he wouldn't break. They wanted to push him out, to wear him down until he rolled over and let them win. But Todd wasn't going anywhere. Let them try. Todd woke up the next morning to the sound of yet another basketball bouncing relentlessly outside. He'd grown used to the thumping, but today it felt different, like a war drum echoing through his house, reminding him of his helplessness. The court, now a magnet for teenagers, was no longer just an eyesore or an annoyance. It had become a symbol of his fight against the HOA, one that he couldn't afford to lose. He shuffled into the kitchen, poured himself a cup of coffee, and glanced out the window. A small group of teenagers was already playing, their shouts carrying easily through the cool morning air. Todd's stomach turned when he noticed something new: a cheap metal trash can bolted to the edge of his lawn, covered in graffiti. It hadn't been there yesterday. The sight made his blood boil. Setting his coffee down harder than necessary, Todd grabbed his phone and dialed Erin's number. She answered after a couple of rings, her voice crisp but weary. "Morning, Todd. What's going on?" "They've installed a trash can on my lawn now. Bolted it right into the ground, Erin. There's graffiti all over it," Todd said, his voice strained. "It's like they're taunting me." Erin sighed audibly. "They're not just taunting you. They're testing how far they can push you. This is harassment, Todd. Plain and simple." Todd felt his grip tighten around the phone. "So what do I do?" "Document everything. Photos, videos, every new fine, every change they make to your property. If we're going to take this to court, I need a full paper trail of their behavior." Todd nodded, already walking outside with his phone to take pictures of the trash can. The teens on the court paused their game to watch him, snickering and whispering. One of them called out, "Taking pictures for your scrapbook, old man." Laughter erupted, and Todd's face flushed. He ignored them, snapped a series of photos, and went back inside, slamming the door behind him. That afternoon, Erin called with an update. "I finally got the HOA documents we requested. Took some legal threats, but they sent them over. I think you'll want to hear this." Todd perched on the edge of his couch, phone pressed to his ear. "What did you find?" "There was no formal vote approving the basketball court," Erin said. "No record of residents voting for it, no detailed meeting minutes outlining the plan. They listed it as part of their community improvement fund, but it looks like Sarah Hayward pushed it through without proper approval. She even filed for the construction permits under false pretenses, claiming the space was HOA owned." Todd's jaw tightened. "So they lied?" "More than that," Erin replied. "They're covering their tracks. And the fines they keep issuing you, those aren't just punitive, they're strategic. By accumulating enough unpaid fines, the HOA can place a lien on your property and eventually force a foreclosure." Todd froze, the words hitting him like a punch to the gut. "They're trying to take my house." "That's how it looks," Erin said grimly. "They're trying to bleed you dry, Todd. They'll make you look like a delinquent homeowner, then swoop in and take your property. It's a classic move for HOAs that want control over valuable land. I suspect Sarah's working with a developer, someone who wants your lot for a new project." Todd felt a wave of nausea roll over him. His house, the first real accomplishment of his life, had become a target in someone's crooked scheme. "What do I do?" he whispered. "We fight this, but it's going to get ugly," Erin warned. "They'll dig into everything: your payments, your property history, even your personal life. Sarah and her board won't back down without a fight. You need to be ready." Todd hung up and sat in silence, staring at the court through his window. The HOA wasn't just an overreaching bureaucracy anymore. There were predators circling him, waiting for him to falter. But Todd wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. If they wanted to take him down, he'd make sure they regretted it. The following week was a nightmare. Todd documented everything as Erin instructed, but the HOA escalated their attacks. Another fine appeared in his mailbox: lawn maintenance violation, $300, accompanied by a photo of the torn grass surrounding the basketball court, as if he was responsible for the destruction their construction crew had caused. Then, late one night, Todd was startled awake by the sound of a crash. He bolted out of bed and ran to the front door, his heart pounding. Outside, one of his windows was shattered, shards of glass scattered across the porch. Lying among the debris was a basketball with the words "Play NIC" scrawled across it in black marker. Todd's hands shook as he picked up the ball. The message was clear: stop fighting back, or things would get worse. The next morning, Todd reported the incident to the police, but the officer who showed up seemed uninterested. "Could have been kids messing around," he said with a shrug, jotting down a few notes. "Nothing we can really do without witnesses." Todd clenched his fists. "Someone broke my window and left a message. That's not kids messing around. That's intimidation." The officer barely looked up from his notebook. "We'll file a report, sir. But unless you've got cameras or something, there's not much else we can do." Cameras. The word stuck in Todd's mind as he watched the officer drive away. Maybe that was what he needed. That afternoon, Todd drove to a hardware store and bought a set of security cameras. He spent hours installing them around his property, ensuring every angle was covered, especially the basketball court. It wasn't much, but at least now he'd have proof if something happened again. 2 days later, the cameras caught exactly what Todd had been waiting for. At 3 a.m., a hooded figure appeared on the footage, walking up to Todd's lawn with a spray can in hand. They tagged the side of his house with graffiti "Move out" before running back toward the street. Todd watched the footage over and over, his pulse racing. He couldn't see the person's face, but their size, their movements. He knew it had to be one of the teens who hung around the court. Todd forwarded the video to Erin, who immediately filed a formal complaint against the HOA for harassment and property damage. "We're going on the offensive," she said. "It's time to hit them where it hurts." The next HOA meeting was packed. Word had spread about Todd's accusations, and for the first time, the board seemed nervous. Todd stood at the front of the room, holding up photos, documents, and the damning footage from his cameras. "You've lied to me. To this community," Todd said, his voice steady but sharp. "You installed that court illegally, you harassed me with false fines, and now you're allowing vandalism to happen on my property. Enough is enough." Sarah Hayward, seated at the center of the table, looked pale but defiant. "Mr. Mitchell, these are serious accusations. Do you have any proof linking this vandalism to the HOA?" Todd held up his phone, showing the footage to the crowd. "The proof is right here. If you're not behind it, then prove it. But until then, I'm holding you responsible." Murmurs rippled through the room. For the first time, Todd saw doubt on his neighbors' faces, doubt that Sarah could no longer hide behind. "This isn't over, Mr. Mitchell," Sarah said quietly, her voice icy. Todd met her gaze with unwavering resolve. "You're right. It's not." That night, as Todd sat on his porch, the court eerily silent for the first time in weeks, he realized something. This wasn't just about his lawn anymore. This was about exposing the rot at the heart of the HOA, and he was ready to do whatever it took to bring them down. The courtroom was packed. Todd sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands gripping the edges of his chair as he scanned the room. On the other side of the aisle sat Sarah Hayward, flanked by two sharply dressed attorneys who looked more like corporate enforcers than neighborhood representatives. Sarah's face was calm, but Todd could see the tightness in her jaw, the subtle twitch of her lips when she glanced toward him. She was nervous. "Good." The judge entered, and the courtroom quieted as everyone rose. Todd's attorney, Erin, leaned over and whispered, "Stay calm. We've got the evidence. They're going to play dirty, but don't let them rattle you." Todd nodded, though his palms were slick with sweat. This was at the culmination of months of stress, sleepless nights, fines, vandalism, and intimidation. He wasn't just fighting for his property anymore. This was about standing up to a system that thought it could crush him without consequence. The HOA's lead attorney was the first to speak, launching into a polished argument about how the basketball court was a community improvement initiative, approved by the board and supported by residents. They presented glossy photos of smiling children playing on the court, emphasizing its supposed benefits. The HOA's actions were entirely within their rights. The attorney concluded smoothly, "Mr. Mitchell's accusations are baseless and stem from a refusal to abide by community standards." Todd clenched his jaw but stayed silent as Erin rose to her feet. "Your Honor, the HOA's claims are not only misleading, they're demonstrably false. We have evidence showing that the basketball court was installed without proper approval, that Mr. Mitchell's property has been wrongfully targeted, and that the HOA has been actively harassing him to force a sale of his home." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Proceed." Erin began laying out their case. She presented the title report showing there was no easement on Todd's property, followed by records proving that the basketball court had been approved by the board without a community vote. She highlighted discrepancies in the HOA's meeting minutes, which revealed that Sarah Hayward had bypassed protocol to push the project forward. Then came the security footage. Aaron played the video of the hooded figure tagging Todd's house, pausing it at key moments to emphasize the intimidation tactics. "This vandalism," she said, her voice firm, occurred after Mr. Mitchell began questioning the HOA's actions. "It is part of a clear pattern of harassment aimed at coercing him into abandoning his property." The room buzzed with murmurs as neighbors exchanged glances. For the first time, Todd saw flickers of doubt in their eyes. Sarah's attorney rose for cross-examination, his tone dripping with condescension. "Mr. Mitchell," he began, "you claim to be a victim here, but isn't it true that you've refused to comply with multiple HOA rules, including lawn maintenance and noise ordinances?" Todd's fist tightened under the table, but he kept his voice steady. "I've always maintained my property. The noise and damage they're blaming me for come from the court they built without my consent." The attorney smirked, as if he'd been waiting for that answer. "And yet you've refused to pay the fines. Isn't that correct?" Todd met his gaze unflinching. "Because the fines are part of their harassment campaign. They're punishing me for standing up to them." Erin intervened, her voice cutting through the tension. "Your Honor, the issue isn't whether Mr. Mitchell paid the fines. The issue is the HOA's illegal actions and their attempts to bully my client into compliance." The judge nodded, motioning for the HOA's attorney to continue. But Todd could see the cracks forming. The once confident board members were whispering to each other, their expressions uneasy. The turning point came when Erin called her final witness, a former HOA employee named Linda Grayson. Todd hadn't known about Linda until the night before, when Erin had told him she'd tracked down someone willing to speak out. Linda was a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, her voice steady as she took the stand. "I worked for the HOA for 6 years," she began. "During that time, I witnessed multiple instances where the board, under Sarah Hayward's leadership, prioritized their own interests over those of the community. The basketball court at Mr. Mitchell's property is one such example. It wasn't about the kids or the neighborhood. It was about positioning the lot for a future development project." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and the judge banged his gavel for silence. Erin pressed on. "Can you elaborate on this development project?" Linda nodded. The HOA had been in talks with a real estate developer. Sarah wanted to acquire certain properties in the neighborhood, including Mr. Mitchell's, to bundle them into a larger sale. The court was a calculated move to make his property undesirable, forcing him to sell. Sarah's face paled and Todd felt a surge of vindication as Linda's words hung in the air. The HOA's attorney scrambled to object, but the damage was done. Erin turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we've established a clear pattern of misconduct by the HOA, including falsified records, harassment, and illegal use of community funds. We ask that the court rule in favor of my client, invalidate the fines, and order the removal of the basketball court." The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable as he reviewed the evidence. Finally, he spoke. "The evidence presented here today is troubling. It reveals not only procedural violations but also unethical behavior by the HOA. The court rules in favor of the plaintiff. The fines issued against Mr. Mitchell are void, and the HOA is ordered to remove the basketball court within 30 days. Todd let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief washed over him, but it was tinged with exhaustion. This wasn't a victory parade, it was the end of a grueling battle that had taken a toll on every part of his life. As the judge exited and the courtroom began to empty, Sarah shot him one last glare, her polished facade finally cracking. "You think you've won, Mitchell?" she hissed under her breath as she passed him. "This isn't over." Todd didn't respond. He didn't need to. She could threaten all she wanted, he'd stood his ground, and for the first time in months, he felt like he had his life back. Later that evening, Todd stood on his porch, staring at the basketball court under the fading light. The court was still there, but now it looked less like an obstacle and more like a monument to what he'd endured. He didn't know what the future held, whether the HOA would keep targeting him, or if Sarah's reign would finally come to an end, but for now, He could breathe. For now, he'd won. The basketball court was gone within 2 weeks. Todd watched from his porch as a team of contractors, hired by the HOA, ripped up the blacktop and dismantled the hoop. The sight should have brought relief, but instead, it left a strange hollowness in its place. His front yard, once a carefully tended lawn, was now a patch of uneven dirt and gravel, a stark reminder of everything he'd been through. The neighborhood felt different now. Todd noticed how his neighbors avoided him when he went outside. The polite nods and casual greetings were gone, replaced by furtive glances and hurried steps. He wasn't sure if they saw him as a troublemaker or if they were afraid to associate with him after he'd gone head-to-head with the HOA. Either way, the isolation was palpable. One evening, as Todd was cleaning up the remnants of his destroyed lawn, a voice startled him. "How's it feel to finally have your yard back?" He turned to see Rick, the neighbor who had warned him early on about the HOA's tactics. Rick was standing on the sidewalk, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. Todd shrugged, brushing dirt from his hands. "Feels like I won a battle and lost everything else." Rick nodded knowingly. "That's how it goes with these people. You stood up to them, and now they're licking their wounds. But they don't forget. Not Sarah, anyway." "Good thing she's out," Todd said, a faint bitterness creeping into his voice. Rick tilted his head. "She's not, you know. Still running the board. She's quieter about it now. Lying low." Todd stared at him, a mix of disbelief and resignation settling in. Of course, Sarah hadn't been removed. The courtroom victory had forced her to back off temporarily, but the system that empowered her was still intact, and she was still a part of it. Rick stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You've got guts, Todd, more than most of us. But if I were you, I'd think about moving. You won this time, but next time, they'll find another way to come at you." Todd didn't respond. He didn't want to admit that the thought had already crossed his mind. Later that night, he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the for sale signs he'd printed off earlier in the week. The idea of leaving felt like both a betrayal of everything he'd fought for and a necessary escape. He couldn't stay here, not in a neighborhood that felt more like enemy territory than a home. By the end of the month, Todd's house was listed. He wasn't looking for a profit, he just wanted to leave. Offers came quickly, and within weeks, the deal was done. On his final day in the house, Todd stood on the now barren patch of dirt where the basketball court had been, the weight of everything he'd endured pressing down on him. A moving truck idled at the curb as Todd locked the front door for the last time. He glanced at the house one more time, feeling an odd mix of relief and sadness. This had been his dream once, but dreams change. A week after Todd moved into a modest apartment in the next town over, he got a call from Erin. "Thought you'd want to hear this," she said, her tone triumphant. "Sarah Hayward just resigned from the HOA. Apparently the board's under investigation for financial misconduct, and the pressure finally got to her." Todd smiled faintly. "Guess she didn't get away with everything after all." "Nope," Erin replied. "Looks like your fight shook things up more than you thought. They're restructuring the whole HOA. Maybe this neighborhood will actually be livable now." Todd hung up, leaning back in his chair. The news should have felt like a victory, but instead, it felt distant, like it belonged to someone else's story. He was out of Greenbrier now, out of the shadow of the HOA, and that was enough for him. As he sipped his coffee and stared out at the quiet street below his new apartment, Todd let out a long breath. He hadn't just fought for his yard or his house. He'd fought for the ability to live on his own terms, free from the weight of people who thought they could control him. For the first time in months, the silence felt like peace. Todd smiled to himself, a quiet, private moment of victory.